Hello and welcome back to the Dental-esque Facebook group. Thank you for joining us. Wanted to talk a little bit today about the process in acquiring a dental practice. So this is sort of the legal process behind it, or how we look at it from a frame of reference as the corporate counsel handling a merger or acquisition transaction, specifically an acquisition transaction in the dental space. When we're buying a dental practice that's already existing. So I think we've shot a previous video talking a little bit about the ways that you can go about purchasing a dental practice. I'm just really going to focus on the asset purchase today. So let's say, again, you are an associate dentist, you've been practicing for a while, you've decided on ownership. Congratulations, by the way, and you found the right practice for you. So we typically refer to that as the target, right? That's the practice we're looking to acquire, and we're going to look to acquire the assets. So at a high level, just to run through, give you a flavor for what it's like, I want to talk to you a little bit about the merger and acquisition process. So to start, again, finding that practice is going to be key. That's obvious. I'm good at stating the obvious, but finding the practice is key. And in some markets, that's easier said than done. So, East Coast, different from West Coast. You're going to have a different market, for instance, in Texas than you do in Pennsylvania, a different market in Ohio than you do from North Carolina. So depending on where you're purchasing your practice, finding the practice is going to be key. One thought there is make sure you're building your network with, your financial team, your CPA, your tax advisor, your legal team, your counsel on the corporate deal. Brokers are good sources, or business transition specialists, to keep an ear to the ground, build that network to be able to find the practice. So let's say you found the practice now and you are in what I would call the negotiation phase or the pre-negotiation phase. So the practice typically has a listing price or an asking price. The listing dentist, the selling dentist, and their team have done some valuation. They've done some metrics on cash flow, on collections, on revenues, and they have come up with a consensus on what the value of this practice is. Now, I will say that is a price. It's not necessarily the final price. So a lot of times there is room for negotiation. What you want to be doing is taking a look at some of those valuations, some of the detail, the financials with your team, with your financial team, with your legal team, with your banker, to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, right? That price that they are listing at equates to what the financials show on what the price should be, given your market, given the location of the practice, and given the historical financials of the practice. So that's sort of your negotiation phase or pre-negotiation phase. You're looking at price, number one, probably term to be negotiated, but there are other terms that you do need to think about in negotiating that purchase of the assets of the practice. A few come to mind are, what does the purchase price allocation look like? How much allocation percentage-wise are we going to give of the purchase price toward physical assets of the practice versus goodwill of the practice? Another thought is, how are accounts receivable going to be treated? How are works in progress going to be treated? How are patient credits going to be treated? Is there any real estate that's coming along with the sale of this practice? Does the selling doctor or selling group own the building that you are buying the practice in? If so, are you going to be acquiring that building as well? If not, maybe down the line, is there a way to negotiate in a right of first refusal, perhaps an option to purchase the building at a later date? So there's a lot of moving parts here that you'll want to think through with your legal advisor, with your financial advisors, on what are those terms, salient terms as I refer to them, or deal points that we really want to kind of negotiate and hash through. And then we're going to move into what I call the letter of intent phase, or LOI phase. So we're going to take all that work that we did in the negotiation phase, we're going to boil it down, we're going to get our salient deal points, we're going to get sort of a framework for the asset purchase going forward, and we're going to memorialize that in an LOI, or letter of intent. That letter of intent is going to be a formal document that you, the buyer, as well as the seller, sign, that you are going to use as a guidepost moving forward through the transaction. to help be the driver of due diligence and drafting of transactional documents and closing. And so that sets us up nicely for the next phase, moving from LOI. Once we have a signed LOI and we know we're moving forward in a deal context, we're going to start, kicking the tires, if you will, or looking a little closer under the hood is another way to think of it, at the dental practice that you are acquiring. So you're going to want to take a look at things from a due diligence perspective. Again, your team members here are going to be key. Your legal team, we're going to be looking at things like judgments, liens, tax filings, all of those kind of pedigree information and potentially problems that need to be resolved as a part and parcel of closing. Your financial team, your CPA, tax advisor, banker, they're going to be looking at some of that as well, but they'll be looking at things probably a little bit more from a financial perspective, calculation of cash flows and revenues, making sure that you'll be able to pay your obligations for moving forward, as well as still earn something out of this practice based on projections and using historical financials to get there. So that's sort of due diligence phase. That's happening contemporaneously with moving forward in the transition to our transactional document phase. That's where your legal team is really kind of preparing the salient documents that are going to memorialize and legally effectuate the transaction. Things like an asset purchase agreement, bill of sale, certain assignment assumption agreements, schedules listing out contracts, employment or 1099 agreements for rolling forward. Everything that kind of needs to happen as a part of the final closing. And then once all of that is prepared and there's been back and forth with your buyer's counsel, your seller's counsel, everything's been resolved and decided, that allows us to push forward to closing, which is the event where all the signatures take place, funding from a commercial lender takes place, wires and the transaction happens. And as of that date, that's actually the transition date for ownership of the practice from the seller to the buyer, so that the buyer can now become the owning and operating dentist of the new dental practice by which the assets are now owned. I hope that was informative. It's just a high level. There's more detail to come. We'll try to address some of these topics on an individual basis in future videos. In the meantime, if you have comments or questions, please leave them and we will seek to address them in future videos. Thank you.